right. Well, good morning, everybody. Jenny, the one thing you probably did miss is that I do have the opportunity of being able to work at the Kansas Wheat Innovation Center in Manhattan, Kansas, and this week's been kind of an exciting week with a lot going on, and I was trying to get my presentation finished up on Monday afternoon, and I couldn't help but notice being that close to the Bill Snyder Family Stadium. The one downside of being that close to Bill Snyder Family Stadium is right across the street about 11 o'clock in the morning, I start hearing them play Ozzy Osbourne's Crazy Train, getting ready for Saturday's game. And so that kind of got me in the football spirit, and it's a little bit hard to focus with that. But certainly this time of year, being a wheat guy and a football guy, it's an exciting time of year. I did go to Kansas. I grew up in Russell, Kansas. I played football in high school, going to a 4A school, having some success playing football at a 4A high school. You think you're pretty good, and so one of the reasons I did go to Kansas State, not just to follow in grain science, was I did want to walk on the football team 25 years ago, whenever that was. And so when I tell that story to my son kind of looks at me and he says, "Dad, there's no way you played football, right? You're bald and overweight and not very big, and K-State's really good." And I'm like, "Well, you're right on all of those accounts, Chance, but I did." And he goes, "Well, Dad, what position did you play?" And I was like, "Well," he goes, "were you a quarterback or a cornerback?" And I said, "Well, actually, Chance, I was a butt back." And he's like, "What is that, Dad?" And I said, "Well, I don't know, but anytime that I was there and Coach Snyder saw me try to get out on the field, he said, 'Gilpin, get your butt back over here.'" And so that was kind of the extent of my football career. That's when I realized pretty quick that I probably ought to focus on grain science and try to find my career professional path someplace other than between the white lines. But still get to be a pretty passionate football fan, and it is an exciting time of year when we have things going on with football season, school, and obviously with wheat and the wheat industry and the wheat markets, a lot going on. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time today talking just an overview of what's going on from where I sit, from where we sit with the wheat industry, a little bit about what's going on with global markets, supply and demand, certainly catching a lot of headlines. As far as headlines go, there's a lot coming out of Washington, D.C. I'm going to touch on that just a little bit. A lot of you have been reading press releases over the last 48 hours of quite a bit of news that's been happening. Touch on that. But then also I wanted to touch a little bit on the domestic market and where we've seen some changes taking place within the domestic market, domestic milling market, and how that's going to lead into the good program that High Plains Journal and Indigo has put together for you today. And then I'm going to end up with talking about a few research announcements that some of you may or may not have seen that I do think may not have an impact on our wheat industry tomorrow, but certainly it's going to have a impact on our wheat industry as we look at it going forward the next 5 to 7 years. So just as for those of you who aren't familiar, I serve as CEO for the Kansas Wheat Commission and Kansas Association of Wheat Growers. Kansas Wheat Commission is the checkoff funded agency. Whenever a farmer sells a bushel of wheat, the first point of sale, by state statute, their 2 cents are collected and come to the Kansas Wheat Commission. Kansas Wheat Commission is directed by a 9-member board that's elected throughout the state. I've got one of my board members here today, one of my bosses, Doug Kiesling from Chase. And then I also work for the Kansas Association of Wheat Growers. The Kansas Association of Wheat Growers is our dues paying membership. Kansas Association of Wheat Growers is the group that will focus on advocacy both at the state level and federal level at Washington, D.C. We also fund into National Association of Wheat Growers, who is prominent on the federal stage and working with the Farm Bill that's going to hopefully get concluded this next upcoming month. So when we talk about the wheat industry in Kansas, something that everybody is aware of, but I wanted to just put it on some slides just to show everybody. Going back to 1996, when Pat Roberts was in charge of passing the Freedom to Farm Bill in 1996, at that time, Kansas was growing just roughly around 12 million acres of wheat. So during the 90s, about 12 million acres of wheat. As we saw markets change, dynamics change, yield increases and profitability changes on some row crops. You saw Kansas farmers, who are some of the most efficient farmers in the United States, begin to diversify, and you saw acreage shifting over. And so in the 2000s, we went from about 12 million acres to about 10 million acres of planted wheat in Kansas, to even now, this past year, we were around 7.5 million acres. And so we've seen that steady decline as we've seen acreage shifts and profitability. It does feel like we've kind of reached that tipping point, or that where there's a bottom, because of where wheat is in rotations and where wheat is in the marketplace, and would expect in 2019, most of the people in the industry do think that we're going to see a bounce in winter wheat acres, not just in Kansas, but throughout the Southern Plains and the U.S. But when you think about those acres change, that's not just a change that's happened in Kansas, that's a change that's happening throughout the United States. Even with those declines in going from 12 million acres in 1996 to less than 8 million acres in 2016, Kansas, even with those acreage changes, Kansas still is what we would consider the wheat state. That's one of the reasons why you're seeing so much interest from industry in what's happening with Kansas and Kansas production, and then also opportunities that are going to exist with Kansas and the Kansas wheat industry, with companies like Indigo coming and working with you. In the last 18 years, 14 of those last 18 years, Kansas was the largest wheat producing state. In 2017, Kansas grew 333 million bushels and led the U.S. in production. This last year, we dropped off a little bit because of drought and stress conditions, but Kansas grew 277 million bushels. But still, 14 of the last 18 years, Kansas has been the leading wheat producing state. So when we think about markets, right, we're talking about production and what's going to happen with markets. So much of it, obviously, is supply and demand fundamentals that you would have learned in Econ 101, but both globally and locally. So I'm going to touch on that a little bit, but what you didn't learn in Econ 101 is probably all the influences that we've seen over the last 3 to 6 months, as far as trade wars and access to markets and tariffs, and what impact that has on our commodity markets. And right now, we all know that commodity markets have been pretty low. I think the soybean contract reached a 10-year low yesterday. So it is a difficult time for producers, and so it becomes increasingly important about how we market and try to extract value out of our crop. I've always thought, growing up in Russell and being around my family and being around my friends and being around the industry, that Kansas is some of the most efficient growers in the world. We're great at growing this stuff. Where we need to improve on is being able to market it and extract that value. And so finding innovative ways and technology ways that we apply to our production practices, how do we apply that to our family farms and to our businesses to also encourage marketing the crop? And it starts with having information and having good relationships. So when we think about where we're going to extract that value, and some discussions going to take place today, I always try to highlight basis. Futures is always going to get all of the headlines about what's happening with futures or with wheat prices, but you know all too well that basis will affect what your ultimate cash price is, with that cash price being futures plus basis. And so when you look at, just wanted to highlight this just as a reminder, you know, we had some of the strongest basis that we've ever seen this harvest year. So we've been fortunate with our basis levels, but it wasn't just 24 months ago that basis was about $1.40 less than what we're seeing at current levels. And so knowing that basis is a moving fundamental, or it's a moving risk factor out there, is important for us to recognize going forward and when we're thinking about decisions for our next crop. I think it's important to recognize when you look at what may have impacted these basis levels. One of the things, obviously, to me that jumps out, and to you also probably, is in 2016 and 2017, both of those years were pretty good producing years, but as a state, we had we've had probably about 11.2 to 11.4 type averages for protein in the state. Basis levels reflected that, where this year we had shorter bushels, and it's going to be closer to high 12s, almost 13 for a state average for the state of Kansas protein, and basis is reflecting that. And so that being aware of what those market conditions that are influencing that, I think, is an important thing when you're making your decisions on your farms. So when you think about cash price, also futures price, it's hard to remember, but futures price last seen, if you believe in 7-year cycles, 7 years ago we were trading at $9, over $9 for wheat. It seems like a lifetime ago, but it was in 2011. Then again in 2013 we were up around $8. But since that 2012, 2013 time period, we've had a steady slide lower in a 7-year cycle, and so this is where we're at today. And actually, this is even a little bit worse than that, as we've dropped quite a bit the last three weeks. We may have found some support in there, but in general, if you look at the last 2 years, the market has set our yearly lows in the last week of August, and so. If you want to try to be optimistic, I'm not here to give you false hope, but I will give you just a little bit of hope that maybe the worst is kind of getting set in right now where we're at with commodity prices as we look at what's going to come in the next 6 to 12 months. So is the tide starting to turn for wheat? One of the questions that's being asked and being looked at is there a wall of demand coming to the U.S. this year that we don't even quite realize yet? A big part of that's being asked because of the production shortfalls we're seeing in Europe and Russia. Eyes on the southern hemisphere of what's going to happen with the Argentine crop and the Australian crop. There are some unknowns, but what we do know is a few of the USDA fundamentals. And so in August 10th, that's when USDA came out with their August crop production report. Some of the highlights of that, just to share with you, it's the first time in 5 years that global wheat production is going to fall. Consumption is going to be at another record level at 744 million metric tons. And along with that consumption, world trade is also going to increase up to 184 million metric tons. Beginning stocks are at a record 273, but global ending stocks, which I'm going to touch on quite a bit, and I think I want it to be one of your takeaway messages, it's going to be projected at 259 million metric tons, with the Chinese stocks making up 136 million metric tons, or 52% of global ending stocks. I think is a very significant thing to recognize in the world S&D situation. When you think about world production and use, if you go back to 2004, 2005, the world was consuming just over 600 million metric tons. 15 years later, or 13 years later, we're up to 744 million metric tons. There's a huge demand story in wheat that isn't really talked about because the world's been able to keep pace. We've had pretty good ample yields and stocks, but the growing consumption of wheat is a heck of a demand story, in my opinion. To go almost 150 million metric ton increase over the last 15 years is really a significant story. When you look at that world supply and demand balance sheet, I think it's important to recognize when you look at not only is that consumption going to be increasing, but where some of that is going to be increasing is in the trade portion of it. It's going to be countries that are having to import wheat that aren't growing their own. But I also wanted to highlight this fact I think is important to recognize also. When you see that growing consumption, it is growing consumption and being in food use, not feed use. You're actually seeing a decrease in wheat feed use throughout the world. So a lot of that's in the price dynamics right now between corn and wheat. But the fact that we are setting a record for consumption and we are using less as feed, to me is again a pretty significant thing to recognize on the demand side. When you look at the world ending stocks, again, I think these are things that really jump out to me. We are going to decline world ending stocks for this marketing year, but if you look at that red piece of that bar chart being China being 136 million metric tons is a significant piece. Global to stocks use ratio being up at 35%. Global to stocks use ratio is not anything that a trader like E.G. or Marvin in the room would get too excited about. But when you take China out of the equation, it actually drops below 20%. That's what starts to get traders' attention. So I had the opportunity to work for General Mills. I worked on the trading floor of the Kansas City Board of Trade. I started in 2006, so I was able to be there when we introduced electronic trading. I was able to see the transition that took place from pit trading to electronic trading. I was also able to, for those of you who remember, that was actually one of the 2007, 2008 was one of the biggest bull markets in wheat history, but then also one of the biggest bear markets in wheat history. I was able to see cash or futures hard red winter wheat trade up at over $13. Spring wheat traded at over $20, up to $25 at one time, even just for a brief moment. But then about the same amount of time it ran up, about the same amount of time it traded lower there. Jenny would highlight that she always remembers that I was there at the Kansas City Board of Trade at that time because of my hairline, because I did, that was a pretty stressful time. But one of the reasons why, there's a couple things that went pretty crazy during that period, but one of the things that people pointed at was the fact that stocks to use ratio got below 20% within the world, and that is what gets people's attention. And so to me, when you take out China out of that stocks to use equation, what's available to the world market, to consumers, because those China stocks aren't going to be exportable stocks, it is below 20%. Again, when you look at it from a pie chart standpoint, just to highlight or emphasize the fact, this is the world stocks, this is the piece that's sitting in China, this is the piece that's available for export around the world. When you look at it from this standpoint in comparison to some of the other significant wheat producing areas and countries, just to give you what's sitting in the United States, 25 million metric tons ending stock versus China at 136 million metric tons, and Russia being down at 4.82. So the Russia situation, right? Russia is certainly a dynamic in the world market that we have to pay attention to. One of the things that everybody's talking about that I'm looking at also is what's going to happen with Russian exports. You can see that their production is going to drop pretty significantly due to weather conditions, but their exports are, USDA has them at 35 here. A lot of people in trade think it's going to be closer to 30. But the other thing to keep an eye on is this domestic consumption is expected to lower quite a bit this year. And to me, it's when that risk of Russian people not being able to get access or have, because it's going to get expensive or because they're going to be competing against the export market, that's when the Russian government has historically shown that they've stepped in for intervention to avoid causing any disruption on their domestic side. With their ending stocks at 4.8, that could be lower depending on what that export number is. The history has been Russian wheat exports have, you can see back in 2010, that's when they did the export ban. 2012, that's when they did a rumored of or threatened with a ban, and an export tax threatened and imposed in 2014, all when they had short crops. Most of the trade thinks that there's going to be something that Russia is going to do later in this year when it comes to their stocks. When you look at those numbers, declining domestic consumption in Russia, lower production, a lot of those things, and the way Russia is aggressively selling wheat right now today. Egypt just bought this week about 350,000 tons, and a big portion of that came from Russia. They've been aggressive sellers, and so that's what the market's worrying and wanting to know when. It's almost a matter of not if there's going to be government intervention, it's going to be when there's government intervention into the world market. And it's not just Russia, it's the Black Sea region. Black Sea region would include Russia, the Ukraine, and Kazakhstan. And so when you think about the Ukraine, a lot of talk was about Ukraine. USDA has them at 16.5 million metric tons. Right now, their government came out and said that right now they're probably only going to do about 8 million metric tons of milling wheat. And so that'll still be interesting to see how it plays out as well. U.S. situation is we are lagging this pace for our exports right now at 27.9 million metric tons for the year. A lot of people anticipate, and it's becoming quite a debate, whether or not we're actually going to be able to pick up that kind of pace to hit that, because it's going to have to really pick up in the next couple months. But that's something that the wheat industry is going to be watching. Obviously, also with Australia and Argentina, what will happen with the southern hemisphere. Australia has gotten some recent rains, and so you're seeing some of that concern back off a little bit. Most people think that it will still be over a 20 million metric ton crop in Australia. Argentina's off to an excellent start. They're, They think about the Argentina crop gets harvested in November, December, so where they're at in their growing period, but right now it looks like their crop's going to be in pretty good shape. Canada's just now getting ready for their harvest, and again, they look to be in pretty good shape. Canada is who will probably be competing for that lost demand from Russia. When you think about the world wheat importers, who we're keeping an eye on, Egypt and Indonesia. Egypt's always been the largest buyer of wheat in the world. Indonesia is slowly becoming, in 5 years, if I have the opportunity to speak to you 5 years from now, we'll probably be talking about Indonesia being the largest importer of wheat in the world because of their growing consumption and growing population. When you break it down with the top 10 customers for U.S. wheat, of the people who are buying wheat in the world, who are we selling it to? These are the 5-year average, and just to highlight, because of some of the recent headlines, you have Mexico and China both in our top 5 of most important customers for U.S. wheat. But when you look at year to date, where we're at for our wheat sales, you can see Mexico is actually only half of where we were on our exports into Mexico, because a big portion of it's been a lot of the trade rhetoric talk that's been going on. But the other thing that's conspicuously absent right here is there has been 0 sales of wheat to China this year. And so when you hear about the trade aid relief for soybeans and wheat and corn, that's one of the reasons. And so one of the reasons why it's going to be really important for us to get those trade relationships rebuilt. When you think about projected population growth in the non-wheat growing regions, when you hear people talk about the world growing to over 9 billion people, from a wheat perspective, where are those people? Where's that population going to be increasing? You can see a big portion of that's going to be in areas that are not the wheat producing areas. So not only is their wheat consumption going to increase, wheat trade is going to have to increase. Specifically, when you think about the Russian export market, where we've lost some demand has been in Africa. We're projected at that population growth in Africa alone, 1.3 billion more people are going to be increase in numbers. And of that 1.3, they're going to be consuming 125 million metric tons, and of that 125 million metric tons, 80 million metric tons of that are going to have to be imported. And so exporters of wheat, growers of wheat, need to know where our markets are going to be. But when it comes to Africa, why has the U.S. lost out on so many of those market share to Russia? When you look at soft red winter wheat, which would be our cheapest class of wheat of the 6 that we have to offer for export, when you think about from a comparative standpoint, if you're out of the center Gulf at $210 a ton with a $28 freight differential over into Alexandria, Egypt, just as a comparison standpoint, Russia, who has a logistic advantage, their same FOB price may be $22.04, which is close to cash price, but that freight advantage puts it in at a landed cost a lot cheaper into Egypt than our cheapest class of wheat, soft red winter wheat, which makes it tough for us to compete for those for those markets in North Africa and the Middle East. So that's why they've increased. Almost 82% of those Russian exports are going to be into that region. And so it's going to be important for us to look at where can we be competitively have a logistic and competitive advantage. And that's why we're really focusing on Latin America. Wheat imports are going to increase to Latin America by 10 to 25 million metric tons over the next, they have increased since 1990. And of that share, the U.S. percentage has gone from 10% up to 40%. So from the Kansas Wheat Commission standpoint, U.S. Wheat Associates, that's the markets we're really going to start to focus and target our resources. So Latin America, for potential export opportunities when we think about this coming year. Iraq was a pretty exciting announcement, the fact that we were able to get 200,000 tons of hard red winter wheat sold to Iraq. We anticipate that's going to be another potentially 1 million ton market for us throughout this marketing year. Saudi Arabia is somebody we're keeping an eye on because of Canadian tensions. And Saudi Arabia is a quality market. They import about 2 to 3 million metric tons. I mentioned Indonesia, and then of course Mexico with the finalizing the deals. So I do want to talk a little bit about our domestic market also, just because I got some of those guys in the room. Don't want to ignore them. I don't ever ignore you guys. I really. So So to talk a little bit about our domestic market, where half of our wheat is exported, half of our wheat is sold to our domestic market. And when we're talking about today, where are we going to try to extract value and how do we need to be responsive? The domestic market is certainly somebody that we need to be working with. And so just to give you an idea, try to throw together a few numbers where we're at with our current milling capacity. Just to give you an idea, in the United States, there's 168 flour mills, annual capacity of about 426 million hundredweights of flour. When you overlay that with a U.S. population of just over 320 million people, and of those 320 million people in the United States, we eat just over 130 pounds of flour, and we are going to see that increase slightly this year. So I try to look at those numbers, where we're milling wheat, where we're consuming wheat, knowing that we are going to increase consumption. Where is that milling capacity at? And so if we're actually talking about having a better relationship directly selling to flour mills, how do we have a better understanding of knowing where our markets are at? The largest milling capacities are in California, Kansas. California is just above Kansas. Kansas is the second largest milling capacity, then Minnesota and North Dakota. North Dakota has the largest flour mill in the United States. That's a whole nother story I won't get into. So if you overlay that, where the milling capacity is to where the consumption is, I just try to throw together this map just to give you an idea. 100 years ago, when we went and started building up flour mills in the United States, the idea was we're going to put flour mills right where the wheat's being grown because that's where we're going to be able to source it cheaper, then we're going to be able to send the flour and the packaged products out to where the people are and deliver it to them. And so as we're thinking about where the milling capacity, I talked about Kansas, Minnesota having the largest milling capacity. The milling capacity versus that consumption where the people are, you have deficits on the coast and you have surplus here. And so you have flour mills that are kind of over capacity for their demand, sourcing the wheat. So you have there's definitely tighter margins and competitiveness, but understanding that dynamic when we're thinking about adding value to the wheat crop, I think it's an interesting chart to look at. And so as our flour mills have tried to increase those changes and address how are we going to add value, how are they going to survive in a competitive market that's maybe even somewhat over capacity right now, you're seeing consolidation in the milling industry. You've seen companies like ConAgra and Horizon Milling come together to form Ardent Milling. You've seen new groups, cereal food processors is now Graincraft. Expanding in size. But with that consolidation, I think it's interesting to me that even though we've had consolidation in the domestic industry, it seems like you've had an increased interest in segregation, being more targeted on what they're doing with their sourcing and more targeted how they're handling their products. And so to me, that more specialty discussion and trying to add value, even with that consolidation in the mill industry, is becoming is percolating to the top. Part of that's becoming because the U.S. baker has changed. You're seeing bakeries now are so much more industrialized. They're trying to do 50,000 loaves an hour versus what they used to do. And it's that day of the home bake, making wheat so that home baker can massage that dough and make the best loaf of dough for that Sunday afternoon is now less of a customer than it is the bimbo bakeries, who's the big guy who's going to be making 50,000 of those loaves in an hour, who isn't trying to massage that dough. All they're trying to do is hit a button to dump that flour in that's going to mix with water that they're not going to see again. And so that flour has to have a lot more resiliency and strength and room for error as it goes through that mechanized process. And so understanding that, what do we have to do to make sure we're going to deliver into that market? How are you as a farmer going to be able to extract value from that becomes important. Also, being able to tell our story. We have Farmer Direct Foods on the program today. I was telling Bob yesterday, I think one of their strongest selling points is their story. The fact that Farmer Direct Foods has a direct line of communication where their wheat is coming from their growers into their flour mill, into their flour packages, is a strong story that I think we're starting to hear more and more from our consumers about where's our food coming from. We've got Tim and E.G. are here from Graincraft, and I think they've probably been out in front on this issue as much as anybody, but more involved with variety performance and expectations. not just buying wheat from farmers, but wanting to know what varieties they're growing and trying to have communications about what varieties are performing best for them to encourage those preferred variety lists. Every year, the milling industry is going to go through and sample and do quality evaluations at harvest time. Great Plains Analytical Lab does a great job of going through and working with industry and being able to identify and provide information from Texas all the way to Montana where some of the best performing wheats are every year. And then EG or whoever's buying wheat will try to not just identify what wheats are working good for them, but they'll also use that information to know what wheats are not working well for them to avoid buying wheat from that area. So as a producer and as a grain industry, we need to be aware of that. So one consistent theme to meet these needs, the U.S. flour mill is going to consistently seek out stronger wheats. The export market is becoming more competitive and looking to seek out value through quality. And it's increasingly for hard wheats, they're looking for farina grafts. So we ask our breeders to work at a lot of different things on a quality, but it's the farina graft strength that seems to be one issue that gets brought both from our domestic customers and our export customers. So as we're looking to increase genetics, we also got to add value, not just through yield, but through quality. There's an increased focus on management and that relationship between optimizing yield and protein content. K-State's doing a great job of coming out. Romulo Lolato, the K-State Wheat Extension Specialist, has done excellent work on showing intensive management, things to do as far as not just trying to maximize yield with fertilizer and management practices, but also that end-use protein content. It's those kind of things that we're going to incorporate to help differentiate ourselves with innovation in the hands of growers. Okay, so to wrap up a little bit here, I just wanted to touch on a few things that are happening in the wheat news. Throwing these slides together as I was coming down here on Monday. All these headlines are starting to break. You had Trump reaches a revised trade deal with Mexico. You had a Farm Bill conference, Big Four ag leaders were meeting. And then you have obviously the announcement that USDA made Monday afternoon with a $4.7 billion farm aid package that's going to be coming out. Sign up available on September 4th. So a little bit about the trade deal. The administration, President Trump came out and said it's going to be a renegotiated NAFTA trade deal. But right now, if Canada's not involved, they're going to rename it the U.S.-Mexico trade agreement. Talks are this week that that's got Canada's attention, so hopefully Canada gets involved in it and we go moving forward. I do think some of the fine print was that Mexico said, hey, we'll do this contingency if Canada, I mean, that doesn't get talked about a lot, so I think Canada being involved is pretty important. But just as a timeline standpoint, it's almost more of a psychological thing that deal got done, because the reality is Mexico had been buying quite a bit of corn and quite a bit of soybeans. Right now they hadn't been buying as much wheat, but knowing that psychologically, that trade relationship, Mexico market should be an extension of our domestic market, knowing that that's going to be in place for this next marketing year, psychologically it's going to be a big thing. And so the timeline on that is once the paperwork gets done, it has to go in front of Congress for 90 days before they could vote on it. So if that would get done on Friday, it would be November 29th before Congress could actually ratify the new renegotiated NAFTA. Farm Bill is going to be a big thing next week. Farm Bill is set to expire on September 30th. All indications are Chairman Roberts has said that he's going to get the new Farm Bill signed next month. The first Farm Bill conference with the House and Senate conference is going to be September 5th. And so from your association standpoint, that's certainly something we're going to be working on and working through that language as it gets finalized. And then the $12 billion aid for U.S. farmers that got announced. A lot of you probably have already seen this, but beans were $1.65, 50% of your production for your 18 production, a penny for your corn. Corn guys aren't too happy. Sorghum was 86 cents, wheat was 14 cents. And so sign up will be beginning for that on September 4th, but it's not, you'll have through January 15th to sign up for that. So it's going to be once you get your row crops harvested will be when you want to go into your FSA office and get that all taken care of. And then lastly, with the research initiatives that have been in the headline, getting the bread wheat genome sequenced, USAID, K-State just announced they got a $21 million grant from USAID that's going to be over a 3-year period. And a lot of this work is going to be happening at the Kansas Wheat Innovation Center. If those of you who haven't been to Manhattan and been through the Kansas Wheat Innovation Center, we'd sure love to have you come through and see that farmer-owned farmer initiative. The one thing I'd like to highlight about the wheat genome getting sequenced and the significance to Kansas, obviously it's going to be the outcomes that come from being able to have that wheat genome sequenced in the next 5 to 7 years. But I think it's important to recognize that that effort began with Kansas wheat farmers in 2005. At a meeting out in Garden City in May of 2005 was when Kansas Wheat Commission sat and we met with Kelly Eversole from the International Wheat Genome Sequencing Consortium. It was at that time, knowing that the wheat genome was 5 times larger than the human genome, everybody was saying that the wheat genome is not, it can't be done. It was at that time that farmers in Garden City, Kansas said, it's significant enough that we want to put resources to it, and we think that our capabilities we have with K-State and relationships with researchers around the world, it's not something that just can be done. It's an obligation we have to get done, not just to farmers, but to the world. And to know that initial investment by $75,000 by Kansas Wheat Commission in 2005 is 13 years later, to see that outcome is something that Kansas ought to have a sense of pride in and look forward to the outcomes. Again, Kansas Wheat Innovation Center, those of you who haven't been there in Manhattan, look forward to having you there. It's an example of farmers that have made an investment into the infrastructure that's helped the capacity on the public research side, but created a culture and environment for the public researchers to work alongside of the private industry to help leverage innovation and technology for our industry. And the last thing I'd like to end with, a lot of you that know me, my favorite president is George Washington. And so I always like to try to use a George Washington quote, and I think it's applicable that 225 years ago, the comment he made is, agriculture is the most healthful, most youthful, and most noble employment of man. And here we are 225 years later, sitting in this room. You all are here to have a discussion about how you're going to help innovate and what you're going to do with your family farms or your family business, and that's going to have an impact on our industry. How you're going to apply technology to be better, I think is really significant, and pretty good foresight by George Washington. But hopefully you have a sense of pride, and I'd like to acknowledge the fact that you're taking the time to explore opportunities to try to better your business, which in turn is going to better our industry. So thank you for doing that.